welcome to this breakout session. My name is Jamie House, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator for this session. I hope that it's a really easy job, because you're going to ask a lot of questions. So we're going to focus on geopolitical risk, and particularly focus on China. You know, as with many people in this room, I've been around the risk universe for quite some time. Geopolitical risk did not really register on the map or on the radar 5, 6, 7 years ago, but now I don't think you can find a risk register anywhere that doesn't have geopolitical risk near the top of the list. So it's really been an evolution, and I think that you know, we can see that today. We had all of our presentations have had some reference, or directly or indirectly, to geopolitical risk. And I think it is very topical. We have this conversation today, we have this panel today, and we're very fortunate to have a preeminent China specialist here with us today to talk about this. We have Margaret McQuaid-Johnson, and Margaret has a very extensive and impressive CV, so I'm just going to touch on a few things. So she is a senior fellow at the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy and Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. She's a distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and she serves on the board of the China Strategy Risk Institute and member of the Canada-US Commission on China. So I don't think there's much that goes on with regards to China that thought leadership within North America that Margaret's not involved in, so we're very fortunate to have you here today. Sort of a format, Margaret's going to make some opening remarks, and we have a number of mic runners here, and as I said, I hope to work very little and have you work, and Margaret work, so we will, with that, we'll turn it over to Margaret.
Thanks very much, Jamie. As we heard this morning from our keynote speaker, Niall Ferguson, the geopolitical stresses across the world are now more severe than they've been in many decades. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused a humanitarian crisis, huge loss of life, destruction of infrastructure, and disruptions to a fragile global economy slowly recovering from the pandemic. The tensions between the West and Russia have not been seen at these levels since the Cold War. This is a time when Canada has stepped up as a safe haven for 175,000 Ukrainians, as well as providing almost $5 billion in contributions and equipment to support Ukraine's war effort. No one knows better than the people in this room what the turmoil in Europe has meant for Canadian companies and financial institutions. While the current global economy has been characterized by high inflation, rising energy costs, housing pressures, and supply chain disruptions, you've been navigating as best you can the economic fallout. Knowing the need to protect Canadian companies, investors, and pensioners in increasingly complex markets, with sanctions to be factored into your planning. Add to that the mounting tensions between the US and China brought on by Xi Jinping's more aggressive tactics in virtually all aspects of China's international relations. Countries including India, Bhutan, and the Philippines have seen China move into their territory to change the borders and take resources. Having promised President Obama face-to-face that he would never militarize the South China Sea, within a year Xi Jinping was doing exactly that, and has ignored the ruling of the International Tribunal that such action was illegal. And now he's eyeing the East China Sea. The longer-term consequences regarding Chinese control of international shipping routes in that region are very concerning. Russia's collaboration with China in the Arctic is also concerning. There have been Russia-China joint military exercises in polar conditions and a joint polar R&D lab. It had been expected that China would try to get a seat on the Arctic Council via Russia's chairmanship, but that was dashed when the council members decided to continue meeting without Russia due to the war in Ukraine. For Canada, an aggressive China with Russian support will be a significant risk in our northern territory. Initial excitement in Belt and Road countries in Africa, South and Central America, and Southeast Asia, with the billions offered by China for infrastructure, has been replaced in many of those countries by deep concern at not being able to repay their debts with usurious interest rates. And as their debt has increased, there has been no relief coming from Beijing. Hoped for employment in the host country often saw instead the importation of Chinese workers who could be paid in renminbi. But for those countries, most of which now use Huawei telecom equipment, extricating themselves from Beijing's pressure is difficult as they have become dependent on China for more and more. In the long term, some BRI countries and even Russia, which has been weakened by the war, could effectively become vassal states to China and provide all its necessary resources, while other countries could swing between the US and China as the incentives are offered. So where does that leave Canada? Of course, we've been buffeted by geopolitical winds as much as any country. We had hoped in 2016 and 17 to have a free trade deal with China. Remember the olden days when that was discussed? But that evaporated, and since the Michaels were taken hostage, our relations with China have been almost nil. We are fortunate to have the United States as our key ally in this bilateral contest. Our attempt to broaden that affiliation to depend on India as another great ally has hit a wall with the news of that government being implicated in the death of a Canadian Sikh leader. I was a friend of China for 40 years since my first extended trip in 1979. Over my years in government, I worked with Chinese, I have a master's focused on China and I speak some Mandarin. I worked with Chinese officials and academics on building their science and technology capacity. But starting in 2015, I became very concerned about the major focus that Xi was giving to China's policy for the integration of military and civilian technology development, or military-civilian fusion, as it's called. I started briefing Canadian government officials, academics, and companies about the risks of Canadian research innovations going out the back door of civilian universities to the Chinese military. And I testified about it at Parliamentary Committee in Ottawa just yesterday. Actually, I briefed a fairly large group at Global Risk Institute on this back in about 2016-17. I've also researched China's innovation system, incubators for startup companies, and joint ventures with Canadian tech companies, including Chinese tactics being used to give Canadian companies, especially clean energy SMEs, only a small share of their joint venture when it's 100% Canadian technology being made, and then freezing out the Canadian partner over time. But I was in Shanghai when the Michaels were taken hostage, and that was the catalyst that made me start speaking out more publicly against that and other China-related issues. China has seen key economic factors drop in recent months, and I mention them because I see them as big red flags, so to speak, for Canadian businesses investing in China. For example, consumer demand has weakened with increases of 18.4% and 12.7% in April and May, respectively, dropping to 3.1% and 4.6% in June and August. There is a weakening GDP growth, with 0.8% in April to June over Q1 and a forecast of 4.5% for 2023, down from the previous forecast of 4.9%. Exports fell by 14.5% in July compared with a year earlier, while imports dropped 12.4%. There's very high debt. At the national level, it's US dollars 10 trillion, and cities are also a significant concern at 9 trillion. Youth unemployment was 21.3% in June, And that was such a high level that the decision was made by the regime to stop publication of the stats. Further, Chinese economists have been instructed not to speak publicly about their work. The regime doesn't want bad news to get out to their citizens. Top leaders will control what stats and economic analysis are made public. All of this, of course, is lowering business confidence. In China, stability is critical for the party's continued hold on power, and therefore it's critical for the current leadership. It's always been said that the people will support the government as long as they can continue to see strong economic progress. Protests in the street around youth unemployment could lead to brutal police responses against recent grads from universities who have worked so hard to get a degree only to find that they're delivering food on a bike. Many of them currently are. Their parents and other relatives share their concerns. Of course, stability is also important for both domestic and foreign investment in China, and therefore for continuing economic growth, but both have been taking a hit. Domestic fixed asset investment growth slowed to 3.2% in August, down from 3.4% in July. Foreign direct investment went from 20.5 billion increase in Q1 of this year down to 4.9 billion increase in Q2, the lowest level on record going back to 1998. Foreign capital used in China declined 9.8% in January to July this year over the same period last year. In fact, in many respects, Chinese decision-making has been erratic when it's stability that's needed. We've seen the on-again, off-again COVID policy that killed tens of thousands of people and businesses and saw protests in the streets. CEOs and bank executives have disappeared suddenly or been given an exit ban. Understandably, this makes other CEOs feel insecure. Companies like Ant Group have been broken up to be less powerful, in that case because Jack Ma was being publicly critical of the regime's regulatory policies on tech companies. The real estate sector appears to be imploding. In August, sales were down 26% year over year, and starts were down 23%. In response, Beijing suddenly tightened real estate rules with little time to adjust, and then reversed policy, further increasing uncertainty. Major real estate companies, Evergrande and Sunac, filed for bankruptcy, and Country Garden filed for an extension on repayment of its 8th bond. This is affecting the key sector where Chinese people have historically put their savings. They like tangibles, not money in a bank. Furthermore, many companies in the insurance industry are effectively insolvent. Some, like Anbang Insurance, have collapsed. China's 86 life insurance companies saw their combined earnings plunge by 57.3% in 2022, and Evergrande Life Insurance refused to release results for several years and has been bought by a consortium of 5 state-backed organizations now. These trends are leading to instability and a loss of business and public confidence. What the leadership needs to do instead is to introduce flexibility reforms in the financial sector to allow those institutions to provide more support for private companies, especially small and medium-sized companies that will bring innovation and job creation. Instead, Beijing focuses on state-owned enterprises and continues to keep a tight rein on companies. All this creates challenges for other countries and their companies. After years of problems in their joint ventures, many foreign companies are now diversifying to other countries in the region. There is an added benefit that other countries follow rule of law and have less erratic policies and practices, and CEOs don't need to worry about being disappeared, as it's called in China. Canadian companies in China have seen an increasing role of CCP, that's the party, committees in every workplace. They are no longer, quote, just organizing birthday parties, unquote, as some used to say. Instead, the party committee is now often substituting its own decisions for management's. In the banking sector, we've seen the dramatic measures taken by Canada's Minister of Finance to protect the security of savings and investments in Wealth One from the actions of its 3 Chinese founders, as well as security risks in their buildings. My hat goes off to Jamie and his colleagues at OSFI on these concrete measures. Pension funds have been very invested in China, with CPPIB at almost 9.8% of its investments. That's more than 50 billion of Canadians' pension money at stake in a volatile country. Yes, some individual investments still look strong, but perhaps the regime just hasn't gotten around yet to the top-down direction of the policies for that sector. It's taking it sector by sector. So which sector will be next? Authorities have started in recent months to investigate the health sector with a focus on corruption and detention of sector leaders. If a Chinese recession anticipated by some materializes, pension and other investments will be impacted. Some pension funds are pulling back on certain investments such as real estate and new private equities. That's very interesting to see. Clearly, they are reading the market changes and the recent economic downturn, though not yet getting out ahead of the markets. And one really regrettable trend I've seen is for pension funds to push back on incorporating human rights into their decisions. Some say they do incorporate human rights and Canadian values without being able to describe the process in detail or identify significant surveillance technology companies such as Alibaba, Tencent, and SenseTime that they've dropped from their portfolios for their role in repression of millions of Uyghurs, Mongolians, Tibetans, and now even many Christians who are being held in indoctrination camps in the basements of urban office buildings. Hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs have been sent to factories across China where they're making products for Western companies, implicating all of us. More than 1 million Uyghur children and 1 million Tibetan children are in residential indoctrination schools, often very badly clothed and fed, and they can't see their families because the family members, the parents, have become forced labor or have been sent for long prison terms. Of course, companies have ESG objectives, so overlooking these socially repressive policies is really surprising. But some in their public reports cite the ESG trade-offs that are made to ensure the biggest impact on investment returns or focus more on sustainability. So in addition to excising Chinese surveillance technology companies through decisions one by one, what else can be done? A relative of mine who's the founder and chair of a $130 billion private investment firm in the US told me recently that it would be straightforward for MSCI to reduce the inclusion rate of China in the MSCI Emerging Market Index for those plans who want to protect their investments from social aberrations, erratic government policies, and market risk. It's currently at 29.79%, China is, of all emerging markets. Certainly, if several Canadian pension plans were a significant investment footprint and requested it together, it could happen. In Canada, our companies are in better shape than some due to our Indo-Pacific strategy, which provides trade and financial support for diversification. Though admittedly, it's taken a hit as India was a cornerstone for the strategy. The federal government is putting $2.3 billion into concrete initiatives over the next 5 years to ensure that it's successful. Further, we have to gauge not just our relations with China and India, but also with the US, which is focused now on technology and national security. We need to align where we can with our closest ally and others in the Five Eyes. This includes aligning our policies regarding company research collaborations. It should also mean that Canada could contribute advanced technology solutions to both AUKUS and the Quad. Of course, there are several wild cards there, and some that don't seem to be so wild on sober reflection. One is a Trump win in next year's election, which could see a pullout of US resources and support for Ukraine, and an emboldened Putin moving to take more of that country and weaken NATO. It could also see the US giving Xi Jinping and other autocratic leaders more latitude to act without check against other nations while insisting on better trade deals with the US. In that case, Canada and other US allies will be in for a rougher ride than the first Trump administration. Looking towards the future in Asia, prospects for China in the longer term are going to see significant population decline. In 2022, China's population fell by 850,000 for the first time. That will continue. In response, the regime is encouraging and even paying couples to have more children, but they're resisting. Bringing up kids in China is expensive, so the regime has opened up Chinese citizenship to those who have been so-called friends of China. Not surprisingly, there haven't been many takers. In the face of economic uncertainty, and in order to distract disenfranchised citizens, Beijing could ramp up nationalist support with its planned takeover of Taiwan. China's citizens are known to be easily rallied when prompted by propaganda from the same companies that we're investing in. Attacking sooner, rather than in 4 years, could have the advantage in leaders' minds of completing the takeover successfully before the next review of the National People's Congress in March 2028, where leadership will be a factor. After all, reunification was the key justification for lifting Xi Jinping's term limits. And some Chinese hope to acquire Taiwan's semiconductor company, TCMS, although its executives say it will just close down due to the lack of parts from other countries. China has been taking notes from Russia on what not to do in a war waged to take over a democratic neighbor. And the daily flyovers by more than 100 military planes and circling of the island by planes and ships are more than intimidation. They're practicing. Such an attack on Taiwan would result in a sudden exodus of investments from China as companies move to protect themselves from a potentially long freeze in relations. So I'd say best to get out before that starts. Thank you.
Margaret, thank you very much for those comprehensive comments, very illuminating, and building on some of the themes that we heard earlier today. I guess a bit of a mystery for some people, and certainly for me, is what is China's end game?
Oh, actually, it's not a mystery at all. You just read their strategic plans.
Okay.
And their plans and their targets go out to 2050. But when they say 2050, they mean 2049, because that's the 100th anniversary of the takeover of China by the CCP. So it's very clear they've got targets for 2030, being the most advanced in AI for 2030, targets for being the most advanced military by 2035, and other targets for 2040 and then 2050. Okay. And so it's actually quite openly available in their documents that you can find online.
Okay, so they look to be world leader in
they
AI?
They have a world leading economy, that's right.
Okay, and so it would be a dominant force, and I guess, is that the Belt and Roads is part of that?
It's part of it, yes. And it's the Belt and Road has a broader strategy, which is to attract smaller countries to vote with it at the UN and to see China as the way that they can have success. A lot of them have taken the Huawei technology and are getting a lot of products now from China that they didn't have before. But I think what it's doing is it's potentially turning a lot of those into vassal states. And Neil, who spoke with us this morning, talked about the two superpowers with their associated allies, China and the US, and then a network of other countries that go between those. I would see it a little nuanced difference, and that is that China's allies aren't really allies, they're customers. And as I say, potentially vassal states, even Russia. Russia is massively weakened by this war and is getting closer and closer to China, but China just sees it as a means of resource development and access to the Arctic, which they want to use for both resource development and shipping lanes.
Okay, fair enough. There certainly is a great deal of stress, economic stress within China that you touched on. What is going to help them turn the corner? What do they need to do? Like you touched on, stability is a primary objective there. So what's going to help with that?
Well, unfortunately for them, their whole approach to policy development is top down. And what they should be doing is working more at the community and SME level to support innovative companies, but instead they're relying on their state-owned enterprises to have a trickle-down effect of the SOEs. And that's not working for them so far, and as their economy weakens, it's really not going to be working for them. And they're now, even the SOEs are very much in debt themselves, and so there's no obvious solution to this until they change their economic policies significantly.
Okay, thank you for that. Once again, we have a question. We have two questions here. Okay.
Here, can I pass you the mic?
Sure, I'm pretty loud, but sure. That was really great, thank you. How does all of this impact, or what do you see as the core impacts to Canadian banks?
To Canadian banks. You have to look at what exposure you have in China and the exposure of your customers in China. That's really critical. And a lot of companies today, Canadian companies included, are still hoping that things will go back to the way they got used to it when there was the attraction of one big China market and so much money to be made, so much money promised. And they just like it to go back to that, the way it was under Hu Jintao and Zhu Rongji. Zhu Rongji and Jean Chrétien got along really well, and Zhu said that Canada is China's best friend in the whole world. Well, they would never say that today. And so those times have passed, and Canadian companies need to recognize that and diversify to the extent that they're dangerously exposed. A lot of them are already starting to diversify and finding companies for their supply chains in other places, moving factories out of China to Vietnam and Laos and Thailand and other countries in Southeast Asia. We have the big advantage now of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, where a lot of resources are being put into helping Canadian companies find new markets. There were probably other people calling for an Indo-Pacific strategy, but when Global Affairs Canada asked me back in 2019 for some ideas for solving the China crisis that we were in the depths of with the Michael's kidnapping and so on, I proposed a range of things, but one of those things was an Indo-Pacific strategy specifically for Canadian companies to diversify to other countries in the region that follow rule of law. Because it's very difficult for a Canadian company to really protect themselves when they may find themselves in a commercial bind and get an exit ban on whoever's appointed the leader of their country in China, their company in China, and or even being detained, as has happened with Canadians. We don't hear much about it. At any given time, there are more than 100 Canadians detained in China. Normally, that's just for a few weeks at a time, but it can be to get to the root of a commercial dispute where the Canadian company is up against a Chinese company. And that was the case with a small BC winery, where the owners, who were a couple, were detained and held for a couple of years. And it's a really, difficult situation because there's not much to do that you can do once you've been detained. You just have to hope that your own country does whatever it can to get you out. I'd like to hear also from others who have experience in China or contacts in China and have impressions of how things are going in China. What I've found when I've talked to companies is that they're best talking to each other and exchanging stories about the experience they've gone through, and to learn from one another. And I've found that CEOs of Canadian companies have been really generous in helping others to avoid pitfalls that they've fallen into.
Thank you. I think we have a question over here, and then we'll go over here.
Thanks. So you mentioned a couple items related to China's plan and strategy 2030 to invest in AI. Like, those were actually very ambitious, I would say, but want to get your view. So, I mean, China, historically, they had some very ambitious goals as well. Some of them were achieved and some not. Do you think that those are achievable? And especially now, the competitive world, the US or Western world is kind of trying to prevent China's growth. Do you see headwinds for them to achieve, or any other impact that may help them to achieve that?
The Australian Strategic Policy Institute that's done a lot of really significant work in this whole area, has a list of 44 strategic emerging technologies, which are the ones that all countries want to be best at. And of those 44, China is #1 best in 37. And the US is just behind China, second behind China. The reason that China is doing so well is that it has been super proactive about going out around to other countries and tapping into their best AI scientists and engineers, their best biotechnology people, their best on all of these fronts, and particularly those that are important to the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army. So those are things like photonics and quantum computing, advanced materials, artificial intelligence, of course. And this is all I had mentioned this policy for the integration of military and civilian technology development. This is a really proactive strategy on China's part, where civilian scientists and engineers, and we know there are hundreds of thousands of them across China, are compelled to work with the Chinese military if they're asked to, and encouraged to try to find military applications of things. So a Canadian researcher could be innocently partnering with a civilian Chinese researcher and not realizing that their innovations are going out the back door to China. So I think right now, I was appearing in a parliamentary committee on this yesterday, right now our best efforts are to better inform our Canadian researchers. There's already a national security screening that's done on proposals that come forward for federal funding, but that leaves aside a whole lot of other separately funded research. And so there needs to be a greater push to be careful of research that's done with universities focused on the Chinese military. And there are 65 of those in China, and there are 160 other research institutes at civilian universities that are working with the Chinese military. And so we need to have that list given to Canadian researchers and have them told not to partner with those institutions. At the same time, we need to be putting a lot more resources into innovation here in Canada with government resources and universities and government labs working more closely together, and then in partnership with like-minded allies like the US and the other Five Eyes countries.
Is there a follow-on? Is that okay?
A quick question about the what your thoughts are on the recent BRICS meeting and the likelihood that the renminbi would become their common currency as a reserve currency.
I think that's very possible. And as the BRICS countries get larger and larger with more satellite countries brought into that mix as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, I think that's very possible. And in fact, in science, China is now saying that Mandarin and Chinese characters are going to be the platform of the future in science. Already, they're producing more research papers than any other country in the world. That's in large part due to the numbers of researchers that they have. And at the same time, our researchers find that then when they partner with Chinese researchers, unless the Canadian is a Chinese national to start with, or speaks Mandarin and can read Chinese characters, it's really a one-way street. It's not a two-way street of exchange. It's really a one-way street, and has been for many years, because we were helping China develop into a more open member of the global economy. This was something we were encouraging them to do, and so we sent a lot of our researchers to China, including researchers in government labs, and they gave a lot to China, and that's one of the reasons that China's so successful in all those 37 emerging technologies.
We have a question here, and then we have one up here.
I'd like to bring in the European perspective on this in your comments. As far as I understand, Europe is very engaged with NATO and confronting Russia and very aligned with the US. However, when it comes to China, there seems to be much more reluctance in following the US lead. Why do you think that is, and what's going to change?
Well, in large part, it's because of the business connections. Germany especially has had very close business connections through research and development and through the whole automobile markets. Their cars are really prominent when you travel around China, and I think there's been a large effort in European countries to give China the benefit of the doubt, and but they're pulling back now because they can see what everybody else has seen. The former head of the European Union in China, the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, has been speaking since he left a few months ago, that position, and went back to Europe, has been speaking very candidly about the risks that Europe has. I met with him in 2018 on my last trip to China, which was also my last trip to China. Even then, he was raising these red flags as well about things like China's corporate social credit system, which has it that companies have to provide all their data to Chinese authorities. Any foreign company has to provide all their data. That's a huge step for a company to just hand over all their data to Chinese authorities, but they will be judged on that data, and they will get more R&D benefits or attract tax burdens, depending on what the data shows and how integrated they are becoming with the Chinese markets and what China wants to encourage that company to do. That's the corporate social credit system. The regular social credit system, which operates with platforms like WeChat, will determine if you are offline with anything that the party sees as desirable behavior, like talking about the Tiananmen June 4th massacre on WeChat. That will get you banned from high-speed rail and banned from airlines. And other behaviors will mean that your kids can't go to school, seriously. And things like this, all judged on people's behavior and what the social credit system is. And that's why Alibaba and Tencent are really important, because they're at the core of that social credit system. And I would just add on Europe that Italy announced this past week that it's pulling itself out of the Belt and Road Initiative. You're right that initially it saw big advantages there, and they got a lot of freebies, especially in the pandemic. They got a lot of the PPE that other countries weren't getting. And that's because they had agreed to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative. In the meantime, Canada had co-developed with CanSino, a vaccine company in China, a vaccine for COVID. And we had provided the cell line through the National Research Council, a government agency. And when it came time to ship the vaccine to Canada, it was held up for months and months at customs at the port. And ultimately, Canada got the message that you're not going to get any of it ever. And instead, that same vaccine was given to Russia and Saudi Arabia and Brazil. So, China is very strategic in how it uses its gifts to other countries and who it wants to bring within its network.
I think we have a question here.
Yeah, there's been various reports about their progress in sort of cornering world markets and rare earth minerals. How's that fit into a long-term strategy? What are the potential implications of that?
Those implications are enormous, and they've been clamping down deals all over Africa in exchange for this infrastructure that they've put in place in order to access rare earths that are necessary for all the advanced technologies. Canada has some rare earths capacity, but it's not even begun to be developed yet. And the reason it hasn't been is that when Africa and China develop rare earths, they can do it in a kind of open pit mining environment that is really, really bad on the environment itself and sustainable development, and also really poor on labor standards. So a lot of people hurt in accidents and so on, or killed. And so it would cost a lot more for Canada to develop those rare earths than it does in China, because the wages are so cheap and the standards are so low. But we plan to do that, and the several departments in Ottawa have been working on that flat out, and we now have a strategic agreement with the US that we will help provide rare earths to the US and other like-minded allies. So it's something really important that Canada can contribute, but we're going to have to spend a lot more money and do it fast in order to step in, because China's got, practically 90%, I guess, of rare earths in the world now, either in China or in mines that it owns in other countries.
Pretty impressive, I guess, from one perspective. A question over here, and then I think we have a question here as well. Maybe we can go to the question over here first.
Thank you. So Niall painted an interesting Taiwan scenario this morning, where instead of military landing on the beaches of Taiwan, it would be more a squeeze of the country as a whole. Just wondering if you might kind of reflect on that scenario and whether you see that as well, and especially in light of what he described as putting the US president at that point for a very difficult dilemma.
I've thought a lot about this, and I've written on Taiwan, and I work closely with the Taiwan Economic Cooperation Office in Ottawa, and it's a huge concern. I'm pretty close to where he is on my thinking of it. The difference is that he actually pegged it to an election year, and early in an election year, and that actually has a lot of merit in terms of a strategy on China's part. And you have to understand that China is super, super good at strategies and tactics, and doing one thing over here so it'll affect something else over there. We're not good at that at all, and as matters of policy principle, we avoid doing that because it could make matters worse. So I've participated in a tabletop exercise in Washington about what could happen in a conflagration if there's a takeover or attempted takeover of Taiwan. And there have been dozens of those, and those tabletop exercises, and the US always loses. And in my mind, it's like a home game for China and an away game for the US. And a very complex thing for them to manage, almost impossible, I would say, in an election year. And I do believe they'll surround the island. There are already issues about the cable. They've cut Taiwan cable from the mainland before, and as I say, I think they're practicing surrounding the island. Taiwanese are getting used to seeing these planes every day. 140 a day, and ships, lots of ships surrounding the island. I can't imagine how they're living, except that everyone I know from Taiwan says it's just normal. It's just normal, but one day it won't be. One day it'll be different. And the Chinese have been using big car ferries to practice. They take soldiers out into the ocean, and then they practice disembarking onto the Chinese mainland from these car ferries. And so there's a lot of practicing going on, and the Taiwanese people are very smart and they're very brave. The Hong Kong people were very brave too. More than 1 million would come out in a day for protests in the streets. But we see where Hong Kong is today. And so I'm very concerned about that scenario. I think Xi Jinping needs probably to have what he calls peaceful reunification of Taiwan. The Communist Party has never owned Taiwan, so it's not reunification. But he wants to take over, I think, before March 2028, which is the date of the next big Congress, when leadership will be discussed. And he needs that to be done successfully. So he can't do it 6 months before the Congress. He has to do it with a enough years to make sure that it's successful and that everything's calmed out by March 2028.
I think we have a question here. Yeah.
You've actually kind of anticipated my question, because I wanted to ask about Hong Kong and how you think things will develop further into the future and what Canadian institutions need to be mindful of, because many of their Asia-Pacific operations are based out of Hong Kong.
I'm very concerned about Hong Kong too. As was said, I'm a member of the China Strategic Risks Institute, which is a global think tank. 3 of our core board members have bounties on their heads now from Hong Kong. That means they can never be safe for the rest of their life. They've been told that they won't be safe for the rest of their life, and some have kids. It's a problem. On the ground in Hong Kong, it's, people are very constrained about what they say and who they can say it to. The whole education system is changing. Significant numbers of books have been taken out of libraries. So basically, it's becoming a mainland city, but not Shanghai or Shenzhen or Beijing. It's going to be a middle level city. And that's a huge problem for financial institutions because it's been such a hub. Lawyers are being laid off now from law firms in Hong Kong because there isn't as much business going on. And so many pro-democracy legislators are now in prison and facing very long sentences. And so on every level, it's getting worse. And I think, that China had committed to one country, two systems to the end of 50 years, and they cut it short by more than 25 years. So, they don't live up to their promises, clearly. And I think Taiwan would be in for something similar. There have been suggestions in the Chinese press that the Taiwanese would be re-educated like the Uyghurs. And that's been an abysmal policy from a human rights perspective. The numbers are now close to 2 million Uyghurs having gone through those indoctrination camps where the living conditions were horrific. And a very large number now have long prison terms. I have a photo with me of an 82-year-old woman who it was just found 4 years ago. The news is just getting out now. Got a 17-year prison term because she attended a sermon, and a Muslim sermon. And so that warrants a 17-year prison term for a 78-year-old woman. And many who don't get long prison terms, as I say, have been sent as forced laborers to other cities in the country, other parts of the country, to work in Nike and Gap and other, Western companies where they're making the stuff that we wear and the stuff that we use. And so that implicates all of us. And many of them will never see their children again. The children being in camps even worse than the Indigenous kids in Canada were put through. And it's the cultural genocide is just horrific. And that's the kind of thing that awaits Taiwan, according to people on mainland China.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question right here.
Yes, you mentioned AI before, and one of the things that's happening around the United States is restricting the export of AI-specific hardware to China. So NVIDIA is creating a special category of hardware that gets around that regulation so they can still sell to China. is there an analogy in the past of export restrictions working? Like, is that something you think would make sense for high tech, for AI, as a way to constrain China, or is it just nation of record? They'll find a way around it.
Well, no, I think it does work, and in fact, we've got the US Department of Commerce entities list, which lists many companies that US companies aren't allowed to work with. And so this is, and the strategies in the US now to constrain semiconductor companies from selling to China, and Taiwan is not selling to China, I think that China back in 2015 said that they were going to spend $150 billion over 10 years to develop the homegrown semiconductor industry. At that time, it was 91% foreign technology in China. Today, it's still 91% foreign technology in China. They haven't been able to do it despite pouring billions and billions of dollars at it. There's more to semiconductors than just, equipment. It's also know-how, and it's the skilled people to do it. So the Chinese economy is being weakened significantly, actually, because of that. And AI is just another dimension of that, those kinds of factors.
We have a question here, and we have 5 minutes, and I think we have, so one here, and then we'll see how we're doing time-wise.
Sir.
Oh, here first.
Oh, you first.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yep. So I guess I would just quote Biden, who a couple months ago mentioned that, it's to define the relationship with China more like a competition rather than rivalry. So I guess my question is, based on what you mentioned, that we're kind of behind on many areas, the rare materials, the advanced technologies, how would you assess the Western capabilities to deal with such a giant like China? And second question, kind of follow-up, is what do you think our advantage in this game?
Our advantage, I think, is our people, because we still have really top-notch people, and when the US, Canada, and Europe can work together on technology development, I think that'll be very powerful. We're not doing it enough, and partly that is because we have so many connections to collaborate with China. And so we have to look at pulling back on some of those and focusing more on building up the US and like-minded countries. China says that it wants to be open, but at the same time, it was the one that started decoupling and that brought in regulations against foreign firms and all kinds of measures that would pull Chinese companies back from releasing their own technology to the West. For example, there's a massive scientific research database that China has. Up until March of this year, foreign researchers had access to it. Now that's completely cut off. And there, for the last 6 years, there's been a strategic technology review of all research publications in China, whether they're just Chinese or with foreign researchers as well. And if the technology is deemed to be sensitive and important for China's security and priorities, it will not be published. So, they're doing this themselves, and I guess I would say they started it. People talk about whether the West should be decoupling. I think we certainly should be de-risking, and that's different for every single company, how you assess that. But decoupling, we will always need to have communications with them, and actually, that reminds me, just last week, there were 2 new working groups that Washington set up with Beijing on on financial institutions and the economy. And that's really important because we have to be talking to each other, especially at the superpower level, and because there can be mistakes made and misunderstandings, and the more we're talking to each other, the better, but we need to do that in a defensive stance, in the sense of not handing over all our best ideas to them.
How are we doing time-wise here, Sven?
1 minute.
1 minute. Is it a short question?
Short.
Okay.
Back to, sorry, a couple of comments ago on the Taiwan conflict. What is your is this a tail event, or is this a 50-50 probability? Like, where do you sit on the odds of this?
Xi Jinping has said that he's going to do it, and I think we have to take him at his word. The PLA and the PLA Navy have been all over Taiwan in all these exercises. You know, how can they not do it? Of course they're going to do it. The question is timing. And for the last 15 years, Washington commentators have been saying it's not going to happen for another 5 years. And they're still saying it's not going to happen for another 5 years. And I'm glad that Neil Ferguson is now saying it could happen as early as January. That's a scary thing. And I don't think the US is ready for it. We certainly aren't. And you know, what happens with the flight of companies, foreign companies from China, because all hell's going to break loose at that point, and all kinds of retaliatory sanctions, and it's going to be a very bad scene at that point, whenever it happens. I was thinking more like 2 years from now, but it certainly could happen before the transfer of authority to whatever next government we get in Washington.
So I think we're going to have to call it there. So look at, one of my objectives was to have an engaged session with you participating, and I think we achieved that. I think that that's testament to your knowledge and the interest in this area. So thank you very much for sharing with us. It was excellent. Thank you.